They sold you the story that 6 inches was the gold standard of manhood. But what if I told you that belief has been quietly eating away at masculine confidence for over half a century? That it was whispered in locker rooms, printed in men's magazines, and broadcasted across screens, creating an impossible benchmark that was never, ever grounded in medical reality. And now, well past 60, you're still carrying that weight. That ends right here, right now. I'm Dr. Valeria, a physician specializing in men's health with over 25 years helping mature men reclaim their confidence and peace of mind. I've sat across from thousands of older gentlemen, successful men, loving fathers, accomplished professionals who've looked me straight in the eye and asked the same haunting question: Doctor, am I enough? Not because of illness, not because of injury, but because of a number that was planted in their minds decades ago and never questioned. It's time we brought medical truth into this conversation, because what the largest scientific studies actually reveal will shock you. The real average isn't 6 inches. It's significantly smaller than the mythology we've been fed. And when you see the clinical evidence, we're talking about precise measurements from over 25,000 men across multiple continents. You'll understand how this false standard became so deeply embedded in our culture that it's affected how entire generations of men see themselves. In this video, I'll walk you through the actual science, the emotional toll this has taken, and how embracing medical reality can free you from decades of unnecessary shame. We'll examine length, girth, how aging affects function, and why being statistically average is not just acceptable, it's actually optimal for intimate relationships. And in just a moment, I'll reveal why even the most famous adult film performers never actually measured what they claimed. Stay with me. This is medical truth you won't hear anywhere else. Before we dive into what the data actually shows, make sure you subscribe to Real Men with Dr. Valeria and hit that notification bell so you never miss evidence-based health information designed specifically for mature men. And if this message is resonating with you already, type truth in the comments. If you're not sure yet, type maybe. Your engagement helps me understand what matters most to you. Let's start by confronting the core myth hidden, the belief that 6 inches represents normal male anatomy. This assumption has shaped how multiple generations of men view their own bodies, but where did this number actually come from? And more critically, does any legitimate medical research support it? Let's find out together. I'll never forget Thomas, a 68-year-old retired teacher, grandfather of 7, who sat in my office with his shoulders hunched and said quietly, "Doctor, I've never measured up." He wasn't talking about his career achievements or his family legacy. He was talking about his body, and the shame in his voice was something no man should ever have to carry. Thomas, like countless others, had spent his entire adult life believing that 6 inches was the standard every real man should meet. He'd heard it in crude jokes as a teenager, seen it referenced in movies, read it online, and nobody, not one medical professional, had ever told him otherwise. This 6-inch standard became like an invisible ruler that men have been measuring themselves against for decades. But here's what's truly tragic. This number didn't come from medical research. It came from cultural mythology, exaggerated claims, and often from industries that deliberately profit from male insecurity. The adult entertainment industry, men's magazines, even casual conversations between friends, they all repeated this number until it became accepted as medical fact, but it never was. Over time, this false standard became so ingrained in masculine culture that questioning it felt almost impossible. And the most damaging part, most men accepted it without ever seeking medical verification. When I tell my patients that the actual medical average is significantly lower, their first reaction is usually disbelief. But that disbelief quickly transforms into relief, because they realize they've been carrying unnecessary shame based on information that was never scientifically accurate. The 6-inch myth isn't just a number, it's been a psychological burden. For men now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, this burden has quietly influenced their self-image, their intimate relationships, and their overall sense of masculine worth for most of their lives. But when you challenge mythology with medicine, you create space for truth. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So now let's go where the real evidence lives. In the largest, most comprehensive medical studies ever conducted on this topic, what does legitimate science actually tell us about average male anatomy? The answer might surprise you far more than any myth ever could. When I first reviewed the results of the most comprehensive meta-analysis ever conducted on penis size, I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking, finally, we have definitive medical evidence. After decades of assumptions, half-truths, and locker room mythology, medical science had produced something unshakable. This wasn't a small study buried in an obscure medical journal. This was a systematic review of over 25,000 men measured in clinical settings across 30 different studies from 6 continents. These were standardized medical measurements taken by trained healthcare professionals whose job was precision, not ego-boosting or myth. The number that emerged from this massive dataset wasn't 6 inches. It wasn't even close. The medically verified global average for erect penis length was 5.2 inches, exactly 13.2 centimeters. This wasn't based on self-reporting or bathroom mirror estimations. These were bone-pressed standardized measurements conducted in medical facilities by people whose career depended on accuracy. It was, quite simply, medical truth. When I shared this data with my older patients, the emotional responses are profound. Some laugh with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Others sit quietly, processing the fact that years of self-doubt were based on misinformation. I've watched accomplished men, veterans, business owners, devoted husbands, finally exhale and say, "So I was normal all along." This is why evidence-based medicine matters. These numbers aren't just statistics on a research paper. They represent emotional freedom. They offer liberation from a standard that was never real, especially for mature men who may have carried this psychological weight for 5, 6, or even 7 decades. But 5.2 inches doesn't tell the complete story, because medical normal isn't a single point on a ruler. It's a range. And understanding that range could fundamentally change how you see yourself and every other man you've ever compared yourself to. Let's explore that crucial concept next. One of the first things I explain to patients after we discuss the global medical average is this: medical norms don't work the way most people assume. We've been conditioned to think there's one magic number, one perfect measurement that defines healthy and normal. But human biology doesn't follow those simplistic rules. Nature values diversity. In medical terms, true normal is actually a zone, a range where the vast majority of healthy individuals fall, not a single point that everyone should match. The clinical data shows us that approximately 68% of men, nearly 7 out of every 10, measure between 4.5 and 5.8 inches in erect length. That's what medical statisticians call one standard deviation from the mean, or the heart of the normal distribution curve. What this means is profound. If you fall anywhere within that range, you're not just close to normal, you are medically normal, and you're in excellent company with the majority of the male population worldwide. I've had patients come to me worried they were inadequate at 4.7 inches, only to learn they sit right in the center of the medical normal range. I've seen the look of recognition cross their faces when they realize they've been completely typical all along. These statistics don't just inform us about anatomy, they tell us about acceptance. They show us that what we might have thought was small could be entirely average, and that decades of comparison were based on false standards. This is particularly important for men over 60 who grew up in an era with even less access to accurate medical information. For them, learning these facts isn't just educational, it can be emotionally healing. But here's something you may not have considered. How we measure makes an enormous difference in what we consider normal. A half-inch variance in technique, a different starting point, and suddenly you're being evaluated against numbers that were never medically accurate in the first place. Let me show you how medical professionals actually measure, and why the method you might have used could be completely misleading. I cannot count how many times a patient has entered my office saying, "Doctor, I measured myself and I'm below average." My first question is always the same. Exactly how did you measure? Because here's the medical reality. Measurement technique determines everything. If you've been holding a ruler, nature designed the majority of men not to impress strangers, but to connect with partners. You've learned that being medically average is more than acceptable. It's optimal. You've discovered that circumference plays a crucial medical role. And you've been reminded that confidence, intimacy, and relationship satisfaction don't come from chasing impossible measurements. They come from accepting medical reality and focusing on overall health and emotional connection. I've seen men in their 60s, 70s, even 80s rediscover confidence and peace of mind Not because their anatomy changed, but because their understanding changed from mythology to medicine. You are not defined by your measurements. You are a man with a unique story, with a body that has served you well, and with years ahead that deserve to be filled with confidence, connection, and medical peace of mind. So the next time you look in the mirror, I hope you see what I see. A man who was never less than medically normal, a man who doesn't need to compare himself to anyone, because now you know the actual medical facts, and the medical truth has finally set you free. If this medical information helped you feel more confident, more informed, or just more at peace with your body, don't keep it to yourself. Click that like button to let me know this medical education mattered. Share it with another man who might still be carrying unnecessary doubt. And leave a comment below telling me what country you're watching from. Your engagement could help another man feel less alone with his concerns. Here at Real Men with Dr. Valeria, I've helped thousands of men understand their bodies through evidence-based medicine rather than cultural mythology. If you want to support more honest, medically accurate content like this, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscription helps me reach more men over 60 who deserve medical truth, not popular myths. Thank you for trusting me with this important medical conversation. You matter, and your peace of mind matters. Against the skin surface, standing in front of a bathroom mirror, and trying to estimate where to start and stop, you're not getting medically accurate information. You're making a guess, and unfortunately, it's usually not a generous guess. In clinical practice, we use what's called bone-pressed erect length measurement. This is the medical gold standard. It means the penis is fully erect, and the measuring device is pressed firmly through the fat pad at the base, until it contacts the pubic bone. From there, we measure along the dorsal top surface of the shaft straight to the tip. This technique eliminates variables like body fat distribution and provides consistent, reliable results regardless of who is performing the measurement. Why is this medically important? Because many men, especially as they age, develop increased abdominal fat. Without bone pressing, that soft tissue can easily hide an inch or more of actual length. I've had countless patients who measured themselves incorrectly at home and lived with the belief they were medically inadequate, when they were actually well within the healthy normal range. This is why I tell men, never let shame develop from inaccurate measurement. When you use the medically correct technique, you give yourself a fair opportunity to see the truth rather than what insecurity whispers when you look in the mirror. But even with perfect measurement technique, there are limits to what's physically possible versus what exists only in fantasy. So next, let's examine the claims about extreme sizes and the medical reality behind them. I once had a 72-year-old patient, a retired engineer, who came to my office looking defeated. He said, "Doctor, I've seen those men in adult films. I don't come anywhere close. Something must be medically wrong with me." The pain in his voice was real. Decades of silent comparison, private shame, all based on a standard that was never medically possible. What he didn't know, what most men over 60 have never been told by a medical professional, is that the so-called 8-inch club is almost entirely fictional from a medical standpoint. In that same comprehensive study we discussed, involving over 25,000 men measured in clinical settings, not a single participant reached 8 inches. Not one. That measurement didn't even appear on the medical data charts. Consider the medical implications of this. If you've spent years comparing yourself to some mythical standard, it's time to understand that you are comparing yourself to something that doesn't exist in medical reality. Even famous adult performers, whose careers were built around perceived size, often made claims that were never medically verified. One of the most well-known gave conflicting reports about whether he measured 10, 12, or even 14 inches. But no urologist, no medical study, ever confirmed these numbers. It was all marketing, exaggerated for cameras, and an industry that profits from unrealistic expectations. These images and claims were never intended to reflect medical reality. They were designed to sell fantasy. Yet, for millions of men, these fantasies became internal measuring sticks, quietly undermining their confidence for decades. But here's the medically liberating truth. When you strip away the fiction, clinical science shows us that the vast majority of men are remarkably similar in size and perfectly normal in the most reassuring way possible. Still, some men say, "But what if I'm not average in length? Does that mean I'm medically deficient?" Absolutely not. Because there's another aspect of male anatomy that plays a crucial role in intimate satisfaction. and it's often more important than length from both a medical and relationship perspective. Let's discuss that next. I'll never forget what one of my older patients told me after we reviewed his measurements together. He looked at me with this expression of wonder and said, "Doctor, are you telling me I've been medically normal this entire time?" There was such relief in his voice, like he'd been carrying a heavy burden for decades, and someone had finally told him he could set it down. And my answer was immediate: you're not just medically normal, you're exactly what nature and evolution designed as optimal. From a medical and evolutionary perspective, nature doesn't select for extremes, it selects for function, compatibility, and reproductive success. Despite what popular culture might suggest, having an average-sized penis is not a medical disadvantage. In many ways, it's a biological advantage. Sizes significantly above average, while sensationalized in media, can often create medical and relationship difficulties. They can cause physical discomfort for partners, create challenges with intimate positioning, and sometimes lead to medical complications during sexual activity. Evolution wasn't trying to create spectacle. It was optimizing for successful relationships and reproduction. The medical evidence shows that most women report greater satisfaction with emotional intimacy, communication, and mutual consideration than with size alone. Many actually find extremely large sizes physically uncomfortable or emotionally intimidating. The medical reality is that most partners want emotional connection, not physical extremes. They value confidence, attentiveness, and mutual pleasure far more than measurements. When I work with men in their 60s and 70s, many are rediscovering intimacy after years of self-consciousness. They're finally learning that their medical worth was never determined by inches. And once they release themselves from false standards, their relationships often deepen in ways they never anticipated. So if you've been pursuing some unattainable ideal, let this be your medical permission to stop. Because being average, by nature's standards, is often the optimal place to be. Of course, male anatomy isn't just about length. There's another measurement that plays a significant role in how you and your partner experience intimacy. And many men don't even know where they stand medically. Let's address that important aspect next. Most discussions about male anatomy focus exclusively on length. It gets all the attention in popular culture, locker room conversations, and unfortunately, even in some medical consultations. But if we're going to have a complete, medically accurate discussion, circumference plays an equally important role in sexual health and satisfaction. Let me share something I often tell my older patients. If length is the king in popular mythology, circumference is absolutely the queen in medical reality. And just like in chess, sometimes the queen is what determines the outcome. According to the same comprehensive medical studies we've been discussing, the average erect circumference, that's the measurement around the shaft, is 4.6 inches, or about 11.7 centimeters. The medical normal range extends from approximately 4.2 to 5.1 inches, which encompasses the vast majority of healthy adult men. I've had many older men tell me they had no idea this aspect of anatomy even mattered medically. Others have shared that they always assumed they were inadequate in this dimension, only to discover they were well within the medical normal range all along. From a medical standpoint, circumference can actually contribute more to physical sensation during intimacy than length does. This isn't speculation. It's based on anatomical and physiological research about nerve distribution and physical mechanics. What makes this particularly relevant for men over 60 is that circumference tends to remain more stable than length as men age. While various factors, weight changes, hormonal shifts, cardiovascular health, can influence erectile quality, the basic circumferential measurements usually remain consistent well into older age. This means that many men maintain perfectly adequate, medically normal dimensions throughout their later years, even if they don't realize it. But ultimately, whether we're discussing circumference or length, the medical question isn't how do I measure compared to impossible standards. It's am I medically healthy and normal? And now that we've examined the actual clinical evidence, it's time to bring all this medical information together. Because this isn't just about numbers and measurements. It's about medical peace of mind, confidence, and understanding your body through the lens of evidence-based medicine. Let's conclude with what all this means for you. I've spent over 25 years in medical practice, sitting across from men who've asked variations of the same question. Doctor, am I medically normal? And far too often, that question wasn't rooted in actual health concerns, but in decades of comparison to non-medical standards that were never based in clinical reality. If that describes you, let me say this with complete medical certainty. You were never inadequate. We've walked through the clinical evidence together. We've dismantled the 6-inch myth with actual medical data. We've examined over 25,000 men from clinical studies worldwide and seen that the real medical average is 5.2 inches in length and 4.6 inches in circumference. Not speculation, not mythology, just evidence-based medicine. We've discussed how medical normal is a range, not a point. How bone-pressed measurement reveals truth rather than insecurity. How adult industry claims were never medically verified. And how